Absolutely. Thank you, Kyle. And thank you, everyone, for joining me this afternoon for this presentation on community lawyering. My name, again, is Zane Johnson. You don't have to say the M part. I am a local attorney here in Philadelphia. Just started my own law firm M. Zane and Associates, which focuses on finding ways to make legal services, legal solutions more affordable for people of modest means. And so prior to that, I was a managing attorney at Philadelphia Lawyers for Social Equity, which is a small nonprofit legal aid firm here in Philadelphia that focuses on helping folks overcome the barriers that they face as a result of having a criminal record. And so the topic of community lawyering to me is a topic that to me, I find so interesting and fascinating because of the potential that I really think community lawyering has to change the way that lawyers interact with and empower communities and people around them. And so when it came to coming up with the title, I paused for a second about whether or not it was too harsh. And I kind of felt for a second that kind of bridging the gap between need and greed, the idea of lawyers being greedy kind of plays into a negative stereotype that I don't think fits. But I decided to go with the title for two reasons. The first being, rather simply, I like the fact that it rhymed. And so, something catchy, I was like, I'll just go with it. But the other part, it was more fundamental, is that I think it really outlines the theme of what I'm going to be going over today in today's webinar and today's presentation, which is that community lawyering really has the potential, I think, in my opinion, to bridge that gap between, for attorneys, our desire to do good in the community, as well as our desire to do well in our careers and do well for ourselves. And so, I really am excited today to present on this topic. And so without any further ado, we'll kind of get into it. And the first thing, I know that this presentation, has a number of different objectives that were kind of laid out that are necessary in order for everyone to be able to get their continuing education credits. But what I really hope that everyone gets out of it is an increased ability to think creatively about how lawyers can interact with communities, underserved communities, and then also interact with non-lawyers, and in a way that really allows us to solve problems collaboratively. And so, I want to start off by kind of touching on some of the misconceptions about attorneys. And I want to do that by talking about some of the misconceptions that I've seen, in my own life, as far as folks around me and friends and family not really fully understanding kind of what I do. And so, for example, my dad is a huge Law and Order fan, watches Law and Order every day, can't get enough of it. And so, even though I tell him stories about what I do constantly, I think that when he imagines me as an attorney, he sees something like this, like I'm in the courtroom every day, it's drama filled, and, I'm fighting and advocating in the court every day. Obviously, a few decades younger and considerably more melanin, but you get the picture. On the other hand, I have a friend of mine, he is a police officer, and back when I was doing expungement work at Philadelphia Lawyers for Social Equity, no matter how much I explained to him that the work that I was doing was post criminal trial, post, the whole defense process, he didn't really seem to kind of get that idea. And whenever I would see him, or whenever I see him, he still says, "Did you get anyone off today?" And so I think if I had to ask him what I do, kind of what it looks like, it probably looks something like that to him. An attorney, getting off the bad guy, helping him escape accountability for whatever he's done. My grandmother, on the other hand, when I first became an attorney, when I first, passed the bar, I let her know, and she was so excited. And she was like, "Oh boy, my wife's a doctor." So she was like, "Boy, you and Elizabeth, you guys are just going to be rolling in money." I'm like, "Grandma, I'm actually doing public interest work, which means that I don't get paid that great, but I get to really enjoy, what I'm actually doing rather than kind of focusing on the monetary aspect or gain of it." I still don't really think that she got it, but to her, I think she thinks, life as an attorney, it looks something like that. And then last but not least, when I leave the house every morning, Sadie, she, so when I leave the house every morning, my dog is, looking at me with these sad puppy dog eyes. And if she had any understanding of, kind of like the world and could put it into words, I'm sure she would think it would look something like this, me going to work every day. And so there are a lot of misconceptions, I think, about what attorneys do on a daily basis and really what our role in society is. And so I want to start by first kind of talking about the role of attorneys in society, and what that actual role is. And to me, I think our role within society is as legal problem solvers. And I put legal in parentheses because I really think that our role as problem solvers and advocates encompasses more than what the average person or what someone who's a non-lawyer would consider a legal problem. And so I think as attorneys, we typically think of every problem as having a legal component, which is true, but when you think about an issue involving, for example, like the dissolution of a relationship, two people are getting divorced and they're trying to figure out what the situation will be, custody situation and visiting situation will be with their children. That's a problem that is a relationship problem. It has, a potential legal solution. There's a legal route, but really solving that problem, the entire context involves more than just the law. And so attorneys in solving problems like that are more than simply legal problem solvers, but they're problem solvers in general, and they have to kind of play that role and look at things holistically in order to do the best by their clients. The other role we play is helping clients and the public in general understand their rights and responsibilities. So the law touches every area, every aspect of what we do, and most people don't understand the different ways in which the law actually affects them on a daily basis. And so attorneys are there to help people understand their rights, responsibilities, and how the law is affecting them on a daily basis. And then also, our role is to help ensure the even-handed administration of justice. And so we play that role by being advocates. And in the court context, that looks like advocating as zealously as possible on behalf of a client, with the hope that the attorney on the other side will be doing the same thing, and that the court, in having all the facts brought out through that advocacy, will be able to make a decision that takes all that into consideration and that is fair and just. So all of those roles of attorneys are not only kind of just, what attorneys do, but they're also kind of codified within attorney ethics rules. And so there's duties to clients, duties of loyalty, duties of confidentiality. There's duties to courts, duty of candor, so to be honest with the court, duties to ensure that false testimony or that false documents aren't being introduced in court, and then also duties to third parties. So folks who are unrepresented, duties to make sure that they understand what your stake or what your role in a situation may be. So if I'm interacting with a third party who may have a legal agreement with a client of mine, I have to make sure that I'm clear to them, look, I represent so-and-so. If you want to speak with an attorney about the issue that you and so-and-so are facing, you're more than welcome to do that. But, kind of just identifying and making sure that you're, being honest and open with someone and kind of leveling the playing field. And a lot of those duties are there to, play those same roles that I mentioned before about ensuring the even-hand administration of justice, letting people know their rights and responsibilities, and then ultimately, obviously, helping to solve problems. Also, legal fees must be reasonable. That's another attorney ethics rule. Who would have guessed? But it is a requirement. And traditionally, the practice of law has been a very respected profession. So with all that being said, how do we end up with so many negative attorney stereotypes, right? And so I'm sure that we can all think of some of those negative stereotypes that are out there about attorneys. You know, the fees that are through the roof, or the attorneys lying, or attorneys not having their client's best interests at heart. And so, you have all of these negative stereotypes that are kind of out there about attorneys, even though the role of attorneys is to really kind of play this connecting and problem solving role. We're really there to serve the public. And, for me, I think a lot of the stereotypes that come up about attorneys have a lot to do with the way in which attorneys have traditionally practiced and traditionally gone about serving the public in their role as attorneys. And so the traditional lawyering approach is one that's really been developed out of attorneys interacting with clients who are wealthy or businesses. So clients who have a certain mission, who have a certain goal, a certain legal goal that they want to accomplish, and money is less of an issue. And so for the average person, some of the ways that this approach comes out don't really fit what the average person is looking for or needs when it comes to being able to receive legal solutions. And so, for example, the lawyer handling everything start to finish, rigid boundaries that limit collaboration with non-lawyers and other service providers. Also, the billable hour. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what that is, attorneys typically bill or charge their clients by the hour, which is, so basically, in most situations, an attorney is representing someone and they're going to sit down with them and say, I'm going to, require a retainer of X amount of dollars, and I will draw money out of that retainer fee as I do the work, paying a certain amount for each hour of work that's done. But for the average person, that's not a business relationship or a service relationship that's necessarily going to work. So like, for example, imagine going to your mechanic and saying, something is wrong with my brakes. I'm not sure what it is. Your mechanic says, all right, give me $1,000, come back in a week, and we'll see where we're at. And so, that's a relationship that maybe works well for businesses and wealthy individuals or families, but for the average person, it's one that really makes it difficult for someone to interact with a lawyer unless they feel like it's a absolute emergency. And then there's also a win at any and all cost mindset with a heavy focus on litigation in the traditional lawyering context. And so traditionally, what this traditional approach means, I think, as far as the way that the average individual or family, folks of modest means, how they end up interacting with lawyers, I think the result is that it's very limiting on the ways in which attorneys ultimately can serve clients of modest means and communities of modest means in being able to help them solve their problems. The fact that there's no collaboration, I think, really leads to a one-track mindset and how problems are solved. And again, going back to talking about really what the main role of an attorney is to be a problem solver and an advocate. And so the lack of collaboration, the lack of ability to bring in other viewpoints, and the view that the attorney has to handle everything from start to finish, kind of creates this atmosphere that makes it a little bit more difficult for an attorney who's trying to help someone solve a problem to see all the different potential solutions. I think also, again, as I kind of mentioned with the billable hours model and then that focus on litigation, it means that legal solutions are less affordable for the average person, and by extension, thereby less accessible. And I also think that the strict focus on winning, which is typically accompanied by a limited view of what winning means. So typically thinking of winning in terms of monetary gain, of getting that judgment in court, I think it really fails to consider the larger context. And so that includes some of the unstated goals that a client or a community or an individual might have. So for example, going back to two folks who were married and now their relationship is coming apart, they're making the decision to get divorced. Sometimes you may hear horror stories of folks who engage attorneys at that point, who don't really take into context the full situation and thinking about the fact that these are two people, because they have children, who will have to interact with one another moving forward. And so just getting the best deal, in the split up of all of those assets isn't the only consideration. Winning also means being able to leave these two people and being able to leave this family in a place where they can continue to move forward with a relationship that actually works and allows them to function as a family, albeit a separated family, but a family nonetheless. And so those are some of the things that, that winning at all cost mindset that attorneys tend to have because they're not working, outside of kind of that legal process and outside of that legal box, that ends up, I think in a lot of situations harming people whose goals go beyond just winning in court or go beyond just getting the most money. And again, that's a mindset that I think really is more set and focused towards a business where, profit and money is the main goal versus situations involving the average person or folks of modest means. It's often about handling and solving relationships. And so a lot of times legal processes and attorneys don't do a great job handling that. But again, this whole approach kind of leaves out individuals of modest means. It also leaves out individuals who, are, I hate the term low income, but individuals who, from an income standpoint, are on the lowest end of that spectrum. And so, that's where legal aid comes in for the folks who, really under no circumstance, even in an emergency, could not afford an attorney. Legal aid is there to provide free legal services, but these services are very limited. And so they're free services for folks who qualify, typically based on income, but the services, again, are limited. They're limited in their scope as far as what different types of services are provided. So they're typically focused on areas of most need, where organizations can really have the most impact. Which means that folks who have legal issues outside of that end up getting left out. Obviously, also the income requirements leaves out folks who maybe aren't within 200% of the federal poverty line, but still could not afford to hire an attorney or could not afford to, or feel as though they couldn't afford to even sit down and approach an attorney, with their legal questions. Many of these organizations also have very limited resources. So they have to, even in those areas where they represent people or where they provide services, they have to make decisions about to whom they're going to provide those services and at what point they have to cut those services off because their resources are not plentiful enough to be able to meet all of the need that's out there and that exists. And then last but not least, for many legal aid organizations, there are restrictions that are placed on the work that they can do by the funding that they receive. And so anyone in the nonprofit community knows and understands this. You know, a lot of times that funding may come with specific things that the funder wants to see you doing. Oftentimes in a legal aid context, especially for organizations that are receiving funds from the federal government, there are certain legal restrictions, you know, that are in statute and that restrict what organizations receiving that type of funding can do. So for example, you couldn't sue the federal government. You could not advocate for folks around voting rights in a lot of situations because it involves because it involves politics and the kind of the organizations needing to avoid the appearance of possibly seeming political if they're receiving funds from a federal program. And so, you know, all of these restrictions mean that at the end of the day, legal aid is there to kind of try to help out and really kind of be a safety net, but it's still very limited in being able to meet that need. And so at the end of the day, between the traditional approach to lawyering, which is really kind of which is really obviously the most prevalent way that attorneys go about providing services and serving people, and legal aid, there's a huge gap. And this is a gap that is referred to as the access to justice gap. And so this gap in services that are available and that are provided to folks really means that at the end of the day, folks cannot end up getting the services that they need to be able to have just outcomes. And so at the end of the day, the whole legal service industry is failing to meet the need of folks of modest means. And that's really, again, like I mentioned, due to an approach that is not tailored to the needs of the average person. And so what you're starting to see within the industry is that there's an emergence of alternative legal service providers that provide services that meet some of those needs for folks. And some of them include like LegalZoom, which provides forms that folks can fill out and really allows them to kind of take the do-it-yourself route. It also connects people with quick legal advice or consultations over the phone. And then you have Legal Shield, which is like a legal plan. So basically, you know, you pay a certain amount a month, or an employer might pay a certain amount a month for their employees, or to be able to have access to legal services for certain issues like writing a will or being able to create a small business and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, you know, the issue with this gap, the real issue that it creates is that if someone does not have access to that legal knowledge and that legal expertise, there's a reduced likelihood that they're going to end up with a just outcome when they're trying to approach a situation, especially one that involves going through legal processes, but really any situation. When it comes to solving a problem, the more options that someone has, the better that outcome is likely to be. And when I say better, or when I talk about a just outcome, I'm not just talking about outcomes in terms of that person getting what they want, but more so outcomes that are fair and that consider the entire context, and then end up giving people what they need out of the situation. And so, you know, really a kind of more holistic approach or more holistic way of looking at what a just outcome is. You know, an individual might have in their mind what a just outcome looks like to them, but it may go beyond what, you know, is actually a just outcome. And a lot of times, you know, what studies have shown is that having access to an attorney doesn't necessarily give someone a better outcome as far as, you know, getting the most money or getting the judgment that they want, but it by and large leads to a much better outcome as far as how satisfied that person is with the actual outcome. And I really think that what that comes down to is having access to an attorney gives someone the opportunity to have access to that process. So to be able to have their story heard, be able to have their story told and their voice heard, and be able to really be a part of that process rather than having that process happen to them. And you know, speaking specifically in the court context, but you know, I think outside of the court context as well, whether it's negotiations or whether it's mediation or whatever the case may be, when it comes to solving problems, having an advocate, having a professional advocate helps someone to be a more involved participant within that problem-solving process. And so that's where we come to and we approach community lawyering, which for me, I really think has a lot of potential to solve and fill in this access to justice gap that we see. And I think at the end of the day, by filling in that gap, we're able to more effectively, I think we'll be able to more effectively address the systemic issues that are faced by traditionally underserved communities. And so my definition of community lawyering is a collaborative, community-centered approach to lawyering that's aimed at addressing systemic issues within an underserved community. That's a mouthful. But you know, it's the key and kind of most operative terms within this definition are collaborative, community-centered, and addressing systemic issues. I think that those are kind of the three main components that make something, or that make an approach to lawyering a community lawyering approach. Those are kind of the three kind of main pillars to me. And I know that there are other definitions out there about what community lawyering is, and I encourage everyone to you know, look more into community lawyering after today's webinar, you know, even if you want to look into it now as I'm going through the presentation. But you know, I think at the end of the day, a lot of those definitions are limiting about what community lawyering is and who can engage in community lawyering. And I think one of the ways in which those definitions are most limiting is in this kind of viewpoint that community lawyering is something that can only be done in a legal aid or in a pro bono context. So basically, you know, we talked about legal aid, but for folks out there who are not lawyers, pro bono is pro bono work or pro bono services, or services that are provided free of charge by attorneys who aren't getting paid. So basically on a volunteer basis. And, you know, most definitions of community lawyering, I think, really see community lawyering as only happening within that space, within the legal aid community, or within, you know, this kind of pro bono volunteer box. But for me, I think that, again, the purpose of today, and again, what I want to, you know, hopefully have everyone walk away with is kind of breaking out of some of those boxes. And this is one of those boxes that I just want to break apart, because community lawyering, I think, can happen outside of the legal aid context. I think that private attorneys can also engage in community lawyering and use that approach, not only to, you know, do good in the community, but also do well for themselves. And so, I came up with a definition of community lawyering that's more inclusive and that takes into consideration the fact that community lawyering doesn't have to only occur within the confines of legal aid or a pro bono context. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward. But I just want to make a comparison, draw a comparison side by side between traditional lawyering and community lawyering, so everyone gets an opportunity to kind of see the differences between the two approaches. And so, again, traditional lawyering is a little bit more attorney-centric. And what I mean by that is not that the attorney is focused on themselves and their goals rather than the goals of the client, but the approach itself tends to be centered around what works for attorneys and the way in which attorneys work, specifically in the context of working with individuals of modest means. And so it doesn't take into account the fact that focusing on litigation or only presenting one type of fee arrangement, which focuses on the billable hour and open-ended fee agreements, isn't something that necessarily works for the average person or that works for a client of modest means. And the fact that there's no collaboration that is able to go on, or there's not that there's no collaboration that's able to happen, but that attorneys in a traditional lawyering approach don't look to collaboration as a kind of real viable option. Collaboration with other professionals, collaboration even with the client in a lot of ways, it really limits the attorney's ability to actually, solve that person's problem, that client's problem, and ultimately is kind of more due to the way that the attorney wants to handle the issue, kind of thinking within that box of, I'm a lawyer, we're going to take this through a legal process, and we're going to focus and prepare for potential litigation, or we're moving forward into litigation, and seeing that as kind of the main route of solving problems. Whereas community lawyering is more community centric. It's more centered on the bigger picture. And so, as I mentioned, it's looking at the overall problem and understanding that, again, obviously as a lawyer, if you're representing an individual client, your duty is to that individual client. But in a community lawyering context, it's also taking into consideration how that individual's problem fits into a larger context. And so, for example, it's looking at an individual who may be having a housing problem, and understanding the fact that if they're having this housing problem in their community, there may be other people within that community who are also having that same problem. And so taking a step back and trying to figure out how within that community you can address that one person's issue in the most effective way, while also either making it easier for others to also address that issue, or addressing that issue collectively. In addition to that, as I mentioned, traditional lawyering tends to be more geared towards litigation, whereas community lawyering tends to be more interdisciplinary, more multidisciplinary. And so it's not just focusing on legal processes and not just focusing on the court system as basically the one place where people can go to get their problem solved. And so traditionally, I think that's the way that a lot of attorneys kind of think. And I think that that's the way that a lot of people think about attorneys, is that, well, I need to go to an attorney when, I need to go to the courts. But I think that everyone could use a mind shift towards seeing that attorneys can solve issues outside of just kind of going through court processes and litigation. In addition, traditional lawyering, as I mentioned, it's more based on an open-ended fee agreement, billable hours, whereas community lawyering, and again, this is kind of also touching on what I mentioned as far as community lawyering being outside of, community lawyering not having to just be inside that legal aid pro bono box, but also being something that private attorneys can engage in through alternative fee agreements. So whether it's fixed fees or a sliding scale, or just all different types of fee agreements and arrangements that are out there, other than just focusing on, open-ended fee agreements, and allowing, and attorneys being willing to be more creative in that space. And traditional lawyering, again, it's a approach where the attorney is handling everything. And so the traditional lawyering approach, a client comes and sits down with an attorney, says, here's my goal. And the attorney says, lays out the strategy and says, here's what I'm going to do to get you to that goal. Whereas community lawyering is a more collaborative process. And that's a fundamental part of community lawyering, is bringing in not only the individuals and the communities and folks who had the lived experience who are dealing with the issue, but also bringing in professionals from other spaces to give us a more wider picture of the problem, but then also give a more a wider view of potential solutions as well. And then last but not least, traditional lawyering is only concerned with the individual client's objective, whereas community lawyering attempts to address systemic issues within an underserved community. And so again, it's, kind of, as I mentioned, the traditional approach is looking at the client as the only person whose goals we're really concerned with, whereas the community lawyering approach, obviously, even if there's an individual client involved, or maybe there may not be an individual client, but if there is an individual client involved, it's understanding that individual's goals and issues in context of a broader social context. And so understanding that, what you're, and so taking into account what you do to help that person reach their goal, and how that also affects those around them who are also dealing with the same sorts of issues. And so in my mind, what makes community lawyering special is, again, the potential, because it's more flexible. It's an approach that I think overall is more flexible than the traditional lawyering approach. It's an approach that can fill in some of those gaps that are there because of the traditional lawyering approach that really isn't tailored to fit individuals and families of modest means and communities of modest means. And that by filling those gaps, service providers, attorneys, nonprofit organizations, just across the board as a society, we can more effectively address systemic issues that are faced by underserved communities. And so it's purpose-driven. It's an approach that isn't just considering that one individual issue, but is taking the entire context into consideration and trying to work towards solving that particular issue for a whole group or an entire community. It's interdisciplinary and it's collaborative, which again allows attorneys to break out of that one-track mindset that's focused on litigation, that's focused on solving issues through a court process, and to really kind of consider all the different possibilities as far as solving problems. It's also centered on community needs. And again, that's going back to, it's not necessarily just about one individual, but it's about an overall community that is traditionally underserved, whatever that community may be. Increased flexibility and creativity, and flexibility and creativity are things that in a traditional lawyering approach aren't encouraged. There's a, kind of a, being a practicing lawyer is a very process-driven, it's a very process-driven profession. And so once there's, one way to do something and people have figured out that it works, lawyers are very hesitant to kind of step off of that track of what works and explore things that maybe might not pan out, but maybe they will. And so, in an approach that's more community lawyering based, it's more flexible or flexibility and creativity are more encouraged rather than looked at as things that should be avoided. And then last but not least, as I mentioned, with seeing community lawyering as something that private attorneys can also engage in, to me, it's an approach that is also economically viable. And so, I think what I also want to be clear about is I'm not saying that community lawyering and the approach to community lawyering should completely replace the traditional approach to lawyering. I think that it's obvious that the traditional approach to lawyering has worked for years and years and years in certain contexts. And it's also obvious that it has not worked in other contexts. And so what I'm trying to get across is that community lawyering is an approach that I think works within some of those other contexts in which the traditional approach to lawyering just really doesn't get the job done and really doesn't solve some of those bigger systemic issues in particular. And so, I've kind of gone through the definitions. I've talked about a lot of the problems or some of the problems that I've seen, and how I think community lawyering goes about filling in some of those gaps. But I think it's important to kind of give some examples so that everyone can kind of get a vision of what community lawyering looks like. Because I'm sure, with everyone who's currently listening, everyone probably has a different vision of kind of what this looks like or what it is that I'm describing. But I also think that that's a neat thing about community lawyering is that this is an approach that encourages people again to be creative. And so at the end of the day, what this approach ends up looking like, it can be as varied as the number of people who end up taking the approach and kind of wading into those waters. And so the first example that I want to give would be legal clinics and workshops. And so legal clinics, workshops, they create opportunities for underserved communities to interact with attorneys and get answers to some of their issues, get information about some of the situations that they're dealing with, and get a better understanding of what their options are, both in a legal context and also thinking through some of their options that are non-legal in nature. And so many of these legal clinics, are held around the city of Philadelphia, around the country every day. I know when I worked at Philadelphia Lawyers for Social Equity, legal clinics were I would say lifeblood of what we did. And so we would hold expungement clinics around the city of Philadelphia, encouraging people to come in, to get an understanding of what criminal records were, the laws around criminal records, give people an idea of what was on their record, what their options were for being able to get those things cleared off their record, and then, how they could move forward with understanding their rights and responsibilities. And the thing about legal clinics and workshops that is so awesome within the community lawyering context is that they're also an opportunity to bring people together and to really around collective issues that individuals are dealing with. And so that has a number of benefits, but one of the examples that I always think of is when I was at Philadelphia Lawyers for Social Equity, you think about the stigma that surrounds having a criminal record, and people are so often embarrassed and just really feel the stigma of having a criminal record. And by coming to a clinic where they're told that your record is not a representation of who you are, that we understand that you should have an opportunity to move forward, that you've moved forward from this record, and that now it's time for others to allow you to move forward from this record. And kind of some of that collective encouragement that's able to come about by bringing all those people together who are dealing with the same issue. I think that there's a lot about that that's empowering, that's outside of, the service context. And so it's bringing folks together to kind of understand their problem collectively, but also begin to see the different ways in which they can also empower one another. And so, legal clinics and workshops are, again, it's one of those things that not only nonprofit or legal aid organizations can engage in, but also private attorneys can engage in. So, for example, I know that there is a legal organization, I believe it's a private law firm out in California that runs a program that is called, I think it's called Coffee and Legal, where one day out of every week for a certain number of hours, folks can come into a local coffee shop and there will be attorneys that are in there. They can pay, I believe it's somewhere around like $35 for a consultation to sit down with the attorney, talk through the issue that they're dealing with, figure out their options. At the end, they can decide whether or not they would like to work with that attorney further. But if not, they at least got a better understanding of the issue that they're dealing with and some of the options that they had moving forward. And so, again, it's being able to, and the clinics can clinics or workshops can be around any topic, and they can be in any community. So a really great tool for legal practitioners, but also organizations generally, to bring communities that are traditionally underserved together with legal professionals to kind of understand some of the issues that are going on and help people solve some of those. The other nice thing that comes out of that sort of interaction is helping attorneys to see issues more holistically, and then helping everyone involved to better understand where some of those different problems are coming from. And so, for example, with the legal clinics that we used to hold, we used to ask people information about different issues that they might have been dealing with, whether it was driver's license suspensions or whether it was potential civil rights violations, and all different things like that, to kind of understand what other issues folks are dealing with, and potentially come up with solutions to some of those issues within those communities. There's also broad-based advocacy. And so this is another form of community lawyering, which typically looks like or typically involves attorneys playing a role as advocates for communities that are pushing and advocating on their own for changes within their own community. And so, the picture here is of the Eagles' Malcolm Jenkins speaking in Harrisburg, the state capital of Pennsylvania, and speaking, I think, specifically around criminal justice reform. And so, he, within this kind of criminal justice reform space, there are a lot of attorneys who are doing work to kind of try to understand some of the issues that individuals are dealing with, that communities are dealing with, and then coming up with strategies to be able to solve some of those issues on a broader level. And so it's not just thinking about how we can solve those issues for individuals, whether it be civil rights or whether it be overcoming a criminal record or whether it be bail reform, but trying to understand how those problems can be solved for communities at large. That can include changing legislation, that can include, activism, which might be geared towards changing legislation, but just also might just be geared towards changing the way that people interact with one another, encouraging organizations to take different stances or not necessarily take different stances, but take different approaches to the ways in which they go about handling their duties. And so, for example, in Philadelphia, around marijuana, marijuana has been, in the city of Philadelphia, has been practically, for the most part, decriminalized. As far as police officers have the ability to give people tickets or cite people for marijuana possession rather than arrest them. But that's something that they have the option to do. It's something that's been done administratively within the police department, and encouraged by the district attorney's office. But the police force doesn't have to do that. It's not a law. And so, it's one of those things with attorneys kind of helping to step in, helping to work around activism that's already going on and advocacy that's already going on, and add the tools that lawyers bring to be able to effectuate change. And I think that the other thing that that broad-based advocacy, that this particular model of community lawyering really highlights, is the community-centered aspect of community lawyering, wherein the attorney is not the focus of what's going on. The focus is this drive towards changing something within a particular community that's unjust. And the attorneys are just an add-on to be able to add an extra tool to the tool bag, to be able to bring extra solutions to ultimately resolving the problem. But the real focus is on the communities and the individuals who are experiencing those issues. Another example, which has been very popular, increasing in popularity around the country, but especially here in Philadelphia, is participatory defense. And so the idea behind participatory defense is a community coming together to support those who are being to support those who have been involved in the criminal justice process as defendants. So when charges have been brought against them, recognizing that a lot of times there is a disparity in power between what that person has resources wise to be able to defend themselves versus what the state or the federal government or whoever the prosecuting authority has versus the resources that they have to move forward with prosecution. And one of those tenets, again, one of those things going back to the very first slide, or one of the first slides, one of those purposes or roles that attorneys play in society is being able to kind of balance out the scales and allow for the process, the legal processes to be able to weigh out the facts and be able to come to a just conclusion that is fair. And so participatory defense helps to do that by balancing out some of the resources that are there. And what happens in participatory defense is a community, folks in the community are coming together around individuals who have been charged with crimes to help them strategize for their defense, to help them talk through and understand the different processes that they're going through within the criminal justice system, and really not just strategize for their defense, but also make sense of everything that's going on and some of the changes that they're experiencing just in their personal lives. And so in addition to the legal aspect of it, there's also that kind of emotional support aspect and understanding that someone who's going through this process is obviously experiencing a huge change in their lives. And so being willing to support and rally around that person within the community context to help ensure that justice is done within the community, within the criminal justice system, by supporting that person who otherwise wouldn't have the resources to kind of really support and defend themselves otherwise. And then the last example that I want to give are medical legal partnerships. And so a medical legal partnership is where attorneys will go into medical facilities or partner with a medical facility to be able to serve the patients there with a variety of legal needs or solutions, or maybe specific needs or solutions. But basically it's the idea of having lawyers meet people where they're at within these medical facilities and providing the services there, with the medical experts understanding that by addressing some of these other needs that may be going on, we can help people to have better medical outcomes. And so, if someone is having issues that stem from some of the anxiety or some of the different problems that they're dealing with in their personal life, having an attorney within the medical facility who can help them to address some of those issues and come up with solutions to some of those issues, or at least help people understand, what their options are, can help reduce some of that anxiety and stress that may be leading to different medical conditions, or maybe contributing to different medical conditions. And so, the idea behind the medical legal partnerships is bringing attorneys right there to meet people where they're at. And this is, a great example of collaboration between different professionals. So in this context, it's the medical field and the legal profession being able to come together and understand how they can, work together to increase and have better outcomes for patients. But it's just a really great example of, that collaboration aspect of community lawyering. So, I talked about what the definition of community lawyering and what in my opinion, community lawyering has to include. It has to include collaboration. It has to be centered on the community, or the community and what the community's needs are. It has to be focused on solving a larger issue. And so whatever it ends up looking like, it has to be focused on serving some larger issue within an underserved community. But there are a few things that I think are also, they're not included necessarily within defining what community lawyering is, but I think are important in order for any community lawyering approach to be successful. The first of those is meeting people where they're at. And I think that's one of the things that legal aid organizations and community lawyers do so well sometimes, is being able to be there in the community. And so with some of the examples we talked about, obviously with the medical legal partnership, with community clinics, legal clinics, workshops, it's meeting people right there in the community, in places where it's easy for them to get to, in places where they feel comfortable going to. A lot of people in underserved communities who haven't interacted with lawyers, or if they have interacted with lawyers, it's kind of been in a much more negative context, may be hesitant to go to the large, law office within the center of the city, and kind of meet within this context, in this kind of huge fancy office. They may feel more comfortable meeting with an attorney in a community center or at their doctor's office. And so meeting people where they're at, it gives people an opportunity to interact with lawyers that they otherwise wouldn't have. Successful community lawyering, again, centers the experiences of communities and people who are impacted. And so, again, I talked about, centering the community, or the community being at the center of community lawyering. And this is so important that attorneys understand, and a great example of this is the broad-based advocacy. When it comes to community lawyering, it's important for attorneys to understand that it's not about them, that really it's about solving the problem. And so in centering those individuals and communities who are impacted, it's attorneys understanding that their role is to add something on in terms of finding a solution, but what they want or what they think is right is not the end all be all. And the real guide in finding that ultimate solution needs to be the experiences of the folks who are impacted, because they're the ones who are going to understand the problem the best, and fill in that context that attorneys oftentimes are going to miss if they're not paying attention to it or not centering those experiences. Community lawyering at its best also views individuals holistically. And so, going back to what I talked about with traditional lawyering, which is typically looking at, a win at all costs and defining winning in terms of monetary gains. And typically is looking only at the goals that can be achieved through litigation. But community lawyering at its best looks at individuals and looks at communities holistically, and understands that the issues that they're dealing with, or that may have brought them to an attorney, or may have gotten the attorney involved in the first place, that those issues have a larger context as far as where they come from, but also in terms of how they affect other aspects of that individual or that community, the life of that community. And so taking that into consideration when considering, how solutions come about, is key to successful community lawyering. And then the last two, I talked about collaboration, creativity, and flexibility as, things that are kind of part of community lawyering, or that are that attorneys have the ability to do when they're engaging in a community lawyering approach. But I think that, successful community lawyering goes beyond just saying that these things are possible, that like it's possible to be creative, or that it's possible to collaborate, or that it's easier to do these things when you're taking this sort of approach to lawyering. But I think successful community lawyering really requires creativity. It really relies on collaboration. These are things that are fundamental to being able to successfully address issues that in many cases have gone decades without being addressed. And without anyone really being able to find a solution to. And so it requires people to think outside of the box. And thinking outside of the box is a lot easier to do when folks with different perspectives are coming together at the table to collaborate. And so that's why I think the creativity, collaboration, they're really key and critical to successful community lawyering at the end of the day. So I've talked a lot about what community lawyering looks like. I know I've talked about it as hard as I tried to kind of talk about it, step back out of my lawyer mindset, my professionally trained, try to step back out of that role. I know that I've, kind of talked this afternoon a lot from the perspective of an attorney. But I want to step back for a second and really, because I know that there are a lot of people on here who aren't attorneys, and I want to step into your shoes and kind of help you understand what role folks who are non-lawyers can play when it comes to encouraging or when it comes to engaging in community lawyering approaches and engaging with attorneys in this way. And so, when I speak of non-lawyers, I'm talking about I'm talking about social workers, I'm talking about community activists, I'm talking about community members, I'm talking about, really anyone, doctors, anyone who is not an attorney, but has some connection and some desire to help solve a problem within an underserved community. There are a lot of different roles that non-lawyers can play within this context. And so the first is in helping attorneys to understand the issues and their overall context. Because of this traditional attorney approach that most of us are used to taking, and that most of us were trained in as attorneys, a lot of times we think of things within the context of being an attorney. So again, as I mentioned at the outset, seeing an issue and thinking automatically in terms of what is the solution from a legal standpoint. If we took this issue, if we took this custody issue and we took it to court, what would the outcome be? But helping attorneys to step back and see problems and their potential solutions outside of that context, and kind of understand not just different potential solutions, but also better understand the genesis of those issues, so that attorneys can look at those issues more holistically. And in addition to viewing the issue more holistically, a lot of times I think non-lawyers can help attorneys to see their clients or see the communities that they're serving in a more holistic way. Attorneys, again, we tend to put blinders on. We're very, kind of focused on and solution oriented, that sometimes we don't step back to kind of see the full picture before we try to dive right into finding a solution. And so getting some of that perspective from clients, from communities that we're serving on, on who they are and how they're approaching a problem or how a problem is affecting them in a lot of different ways, and just really being able to see our clients in the communities that we're serving more holistically. Non-lawyers can play a huge role in helping to broaden that perspective for attorneys. Acting as a connector of people, of resources. Non-lawyers have connections and have connections to people outside of the space where lawyers are typically work in. And so, for example, if an attorney is really interested in solving an issue within a community, let's say a housing issue, for example, if they're really interested in solving that problem, and they want to advocate for new legislation and they want to go to Harrisburg to advocate for that legislation, they may need to find people who have experienced that problem to give life to it, so that the folks who they're advocating in front of can really see and really, feel the impact that the problem is having on folks who are affected. And so folks who are non-lawyers can play that role of connecting attorneys, either with folks who are experiencing the problem, or, connecting attorneys with folks who may have solutions that are outside of what attorneys, kind of the bounds that attorneys typically work in. And again, a lot of this is all about widening perspective. And so helping attorneys to think outside of the box, to think in ways that they typically don't think when it comes to solving problems. And then last but not least, in engaging new communities. And so a lot of times, I think all of us, it's not just attorneys, we tend to get comfortable within the spaces in which we work and tend to get comfortable, we're creatures of habit. So we tend to get comfortable with what we're doing on a daily basis, and we kind of fall into a rhythm. And so, non-lawyers can help attorneys to engage with communities that are typically underserved by just approaching them and saying, hey, would you be interested in helping to solve this issue? We've got some thoughts on ways that, we could do that, but we'd love to have the opinion of an attorney or an attorney to work with to help us make these things a reality. And so just encouraging attorneys and encouraging others to engage with communities that they typically wouldn't. And so just to give some examples of community lawyering that are going on, or organizations that are engaging in community lawyering in Philadelphia and, on a national stage. Of course, I mentioned Philadelphia Lawyers for Social Equity, an organization that I used to work with, which does work around helping people to overcome the stigma that they have as a result of having a criminal record, holding expungement clinics. I think they're now also holding pardon clinics, but really helping to provide services to folks that help them to remove information from their record and escape some of that stigma that comes with having a criminal record. The Legal Clinic for the Disabled, which is an organization that works with different medical, that really has pioneered, I'll just say it like this, has pioneered in Philadelphia the whole medical legal partnership model, and maybe even across the country, but I'm not sure on that. But, they've really just done a great job of making the medical legal partnership model work and kind of exemplifying the best of what that model kind of brings to the table. There's Face to Face in Germantown. There's the Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project, the Public Interest Law Center, the American Civil Liberties Union, FAM, which I forget what FAM stands for, but you can Google them. Legal Empowerment Group, which is actually a nonprofit legal aid organization here in Philadelphia that really takes and embraces a community lawyering approach in a lot of the things that they do, as far as holding legal workshops and doing different things that are really just out there in the community. And then, of course, my own law firm, which I recently started, a lot of the work that I'm focusing on doing is built around an approach to community lawyering. And so again, community lawyering, it's not something that I see replacing the kind of traditional way of lawyering, or the traditional way that lawyers go about helping their clients and helping individuals and helping groups. But it's something that, again, it supplements and it fills in that gap that is left by a traditional approach that isn't really fit for folks of modest means. And so community lawyering, I think, can help fill in those gaps. And by filling in those gaps, again, I think that it's an approach that ultimately can bring a lot of benefit towards solving some of those unsolved issues within underserved communities. And so with that, that is the end of my presentation. I really appreciate everyone who tuned in today. But I will, at this point, open it up for questions. If anyone has any, you can feel free to just type them in. I'll see them pop up, and as those questions roll in, I will, answer them one by one. So if you have any questions, you know, just feel free to put them out there. So I'm not seeing any questions. Either that's a good thing because I answered all the questions that you had coming in, or no one's paying attention anymore. So I'm not sure which one, but I'll give it maybe like 30 more seconds if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, and while the audience mulls that over, I just want to mention that oftentimes we do get a lot of questions, but that's because there's a lot of content that is not covered. I want to thank you for such an extensive and an exhaustive presentation on this topic, because there was a lot that I didn't know about and a lot of questions I actually had about community lawyering that you absolutely did answer. So while you guys think that over, yeah, I just want to also thank you for the resources you provided on one of the later slides.
Well, thank you, Kyle. Thanks to Philadelphia Fight. I want to also give a shout out and thank Dion Powell, who helped bring this together. He's legal counsel with Philadelphia Fight. But I also, you know, last and definitely, certainly not least, I want to thank everyone who tuned into today's webinar. I hope it was worthwhile. If nothing else, you got some continuing education credits out of it. If anyone has any follow-up questions, you can definitely feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or reach out to me. And my website, which will hopefully be up in the next few days. I'm really excited. I've been working on it for months, but that's going to be mza.legal. mza.legal. So within the next week or two, hopefully you'll be able to check me out on the internet. And always feel free to connect. I'm always open to connecting with people who are interested in purpose-driven and just really just interested in you know, having a bigger impact on society. And so I thank everyone again for coming out, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon.